Who's calling 911? Where's your emergency?
It's like a non-emergency. We want to report a missing person. It's my sister.
How old is she?
She's 25.
And what is her name?
Samira Watkins.
Where's the last place you saw her?
Last place I seen her was Thursday night around 8 o'clock.
All right, we'll get an officer over there to you.
Samira Watkins' sister reported her missing and made it very clear that it was highly unusual for her to go several days without talking to anybody.
Sometimes people just get up and leave. But that wasn't the case with her personality. Samira Watkins was a parent, and she had a job.
Samira's family said that she was a student, a hard worker, a young mother.
She was doing her best to do well for herself. She was in college. She was seeking a career in the dental field.
She was just a beautiful young girl with her future ahead of her. This wasn't a girl that would typically just go off the radar without talking to her family, without going to work, without reporting to school.
Those facts definitely gave me reason to be very concerned that this could actually be more than just a missing person.
Samira's sister said that the night Samira went missing, Samira worked a shift at her job. She went home. She changed her clothes. She let her sister know that she was going over to talk to her boyfriend, Zachary Littleton, and that she would be home later that night. She was never seen or heard from again.
So it just made sense to go ahead and talk to Zachary Littleton as quickly as possible to see whether or not Samira had actually made it to his apartment. He could very well be the last person that had seen her.
You'll have a seat here. I'll be right back, okay?
Zachary Littleton was a 24-year-old member of the United States Navy. He was stationed here in Pensacola at Pensacola Naval Air Station, and Littleton was Samira's boyfriend. My goals of this first interview were to find Samira. Missing person, you want to resolve that as soon as you can. The longer that goes, the more unlikely it is that that's going to end well. A secondary goal was to lock Zachary Littleton into a statement.
So that later on, should we discover evidence that's in direct confrontation with the statement that he gave earlier, maybe he'll break or change his story.
What's your full God-given birth name?
Zachary Antoine Littleton.
What's your address?
I was staying at 3500 Creighton Road at the apartment, but I moved the last 2 days. Because my wife and my daughter, they'll be here Friday at 6. She was stationed in Goose Creek, and I'm stationed here, so the Navy decided to put us together, so we...
Oh, so you're both in the Navy?
Right.
Where's Goose Creek?
South Carolina.
So y'all finally get to be together. Cool. That's really good.
We learned Zachary Littleton was married to an enlisted Navy sailor who lived out of town and was caring for their child.
Littleton was a bit of a playboy. That's easily an indicator of somebody that's flat out a liar and who probably will lie about other things.
So you know the reason why you're here, we had that discussion over the phone.
Yeah, about Sammy going missing.
You know her as Sammy?
Yeah.
Okay. But you've had some dealings with her, and you've talked to her.
Yeah, she's been over to the house like maybe 4 or 5 times. We'll chill, kick it or whatever, but you know, it wasn't nothing really a relationship. It was just friends, is what I thought it was.
So you've known her for how long then?
It's a few months, not a whole year. It's been a few months.
Did your wife know that you were talking to this girl?
No.
Okay. Would that be a problem if she knew that?
No, because she knew I have a lot of friends.
Did you have any kind of a relationship with Sammy that was more than just friends?
No.
I want you to know that I'm not the military. I don't have any intention of telling anybody else anything that is said in this room. I want to make that clear so that I want you to feel free to tell me everything without you worrying about getting in trouble from your wife or getting in trouble at work.
The military does not look fondly upon members committing adultery.
You can be demoted in rank, or you could actually be discharged from the military for having an adulterous relationship.
So I thought that maybe he was lying because of that. But it could also be because he's lying to avoid getting in trouble for what we're investigating.
I understand that we're looking into this case, and I really need to know the exact extent of y'all's relationship.
Okay, we had sex once or twice.
Okay.
It wasn't no every time we saw each other, because she only been over maybe, like I say, 4 or 5 times.
Okay.
It certainly is a strike against him early on. I mean, we've been talking for 3 minutes at this point, and he's already lied. Most people aren't going to lie about things unless they've done something wrong.
I need you to tell me exactly when you saw her last. When it's definitely Wednesday.
Yeah. Wednesday, somebody dropped off. She was like, why you coming just popping up at my house like that? And I was like, you know what? You need to leave.
All right,
And
what's
then
up?
she was getting like attached, so I just told her, I'm married. I got a daughter, so why should it? It was good while I was there, and you knew it from the gate. You knew it from the beginning that you weren't gonna be the woman in my life. And that's when I took her home.
Have you seen her any time since when you dropped her off?
No, I haven't.
But it's definitely Wednesday.
Yeah.
My first thought was maybe he had his days mixed up. Samira's sister told us that when she last saw Samira, Thursday night, Samira was leaving to go meet with Zachary Littleton at his apartment. But I really nailed that point down. Now he's actually saying, no, I didn't even see her at all on Thursday. I saw her the night before.
So we're trying to paint the person in corners and then see if they're going to give us something where we can kick the door open and confront them with the actual crime that we're investigating.
Does it strike you as odd that we're here talking about her?
It struck me, yeah, because now she missing. And excuse me, but it messes me up.
How does it mess you up?
Because how is that possible? I mean, I didn't do it. Anything, I'm not responsible for her being missing. I hate it for her because she was a nice person. She wasn't no feisty type or no. She had good tendencies to be a good woman.
There was a period during the interview where Zachary Littleton would refer to Samira in the past tense. She was this, or she was that. That struck me as odd. At this point, she is missing, but she could be any number of places and be perfectly fine.
All right, I can tell you're ready to go.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm ready to get you out of here.
I ended the first interview with Littleton because I was trying to maintain the ability to have him come back for a second interview later on in the investigation. Littleton had definitely not relieved my suspicions of him, nor did he lead me to where she was at. And as he left, I felt like he very well could be responsible for Samira's disappearance.
Before Watkins went missing on October 29th, she told her mother she was going to her boyfriend's apartment to talk to him.
Nobody saw or heard from her after. Samira's sister, April Joseph, says Samira only knew the man for a few months. Family members say the man is a married sailor.
If we were going to find Samira alive, we really needed to find something out very soon. Even if she was just somewhere hiding, getting some kind of information could help us to find her.
Samira Watkins had recently become pregnant.
Samira's family made it very clear that Littleton definitely knew she was pregnant and that the baby was his.
Her family said that Zachary Littleton was not happy about this information.
Zachary Littleton was so against her pregnancy that he encouraged her to get an abortion. On the night that Samira went missing, Samira's phone had pinged a tower right in the area of Littleton's apartment. Zachary Littleton told me in this initial interview he never saw her that night. We were beginning to see more vividly that Littleton was very likely to be responsible for whatever happened to Samira.
Alright, I'll be right back.
We decided to ramp up our approach a little bit. This interview was not as laid back as the first. We still did not know where Samira was, if she was alive, dead. We really hoped we'd get some answers.
This Detective Harnett. Come on. Feel good, feel good.
We're seeing if we couldn't get him to either add information, break completely, or to set traps for later understanding in the investigative process.
We're going to talk about what's going on and hope that we can maybe try and figure some stuff out. Okay. What do you think happened with her?
In what aspect?
I mean, where's she at now? Okay, what do you think though? I understand that, but I mean, what do you think? What do you think?
I don't know what to think.
You need to.
Yeah.
You need to.
I need to?
Yeah. You need to. You need to think real hard about different possibilities. What are the possibilities that you come up with in your own head?
I ain't really thought about it like that.
Yeah, you have.
No, I ain't.
That's totally unnatural. Anybody in this situation who was innocent, they're going to be racking their brain thinking about what happened to this person, and now it's a matter of challenging and see if he'll come off of that story.
I need you to talk your brain. Okay, I'm hoping that maybe you can tell us some places that we might go look based on your conversation with her, because if we find her, we can resolve the whole issue, right? So.
And me standing up and raising my voice and projecting it a little bit more, it's testing to see if they're susceptible to a person showing dominance over them.
I mean, maybe something happened to her en route.
Okay.
Maybe she did tell people she was on with in my house.
What sort of thing would possibly happen to her while she was around?
A carjacking, I don't know, rape. She probably stopped went somewhere else and didn't make it in my house, I don't know.
At this point, the main thing that concerned me was his avoidance of the pregnancy issue. He has to realize that him being the father of her unborn child puts him pretty high on the motive list, and I wanted to talk about it.
It's a matter of trying to present new stresses to see what he might be susceptible to, in the hopes of you breaking new information loose.
You acknowledge that she's pregnant, right?
She said she was.
At some point, she has to drop a bomb on you that she thinks it's your kid.
Right. I mean, that's
When did that happen?
She never told me it was my kid.
I'm not buying that for her.
Alright.
What did she actually say?
I mean, she just told me, she said, I'm gonna need some help with this baby, and I was like, well, I can't help you, I don't have the room in my finances.
What sort of help did she ask for?
Pampers and baby wipes and food. It's just, as she said, it was your baby, it's your baby thing. She never said that.
Why would she expect you to buy the supplies then? I don't know.
But we're almost in a debate, and we're seeing if we can use the intelligent side of the debate to get him to change his mind. And it's another strategy that we'll employ to try and get someone to change their story.
I think ultimately the issue is that you just don't want to be involved because it's messy.
Yeah, it is messy.
Okay, it's messy. It's not good. Okay, there's no wonderful sunshine and rainbow at the end of this.
On the morning of November 3rd, some jet skiers found a large duffel bag that was washed up on shore of a waterway very close to Pensacola Naval Air Station. The bag had a foul odor coming from it. There was insect activity on and around it, and there was even blood that was seeping out of the bag. When the sheriff's office got there and they opened it up, they did find a body of a female inside of that bag, deceased.
She had no clothing on except a bra, and she was curled up in the fetal position inside of the duffel bag.
The other portion of it was that her face was taped up, which is also a behavior that someone who has a relationship with a victim will do to hide their face, almost as if to hide the shame of what took place.
A latent fingerprint examiner was able to conduct a fingerprint comparison on site, and they were able to report that indeed this was Samira Watkins. We later learned that cause of death was asphyxiation, most likely a strangulation. It completely changed the whole look of the investigation. It was now a homicide, and Littleton was our main suspect.
When we opened the bag, there's a few things that we learned. First and foremost, she was missing an earring.
When Samira went missing, we knew that she had been wearing both earrings because we obtained the video surveillance from her employer.
Finding that second earring would be so important. If I found it in the possession of an individual, they would certainly be potentially the killer. There was also a couple of paper towels in the bag. You could clearly see that it had a distinct pattern on it. It was more or less pulled up into the driveway and just abandoned.
So we started pulling video footage from the area. We found a local restaurant where we found footage of Littleton walking in the night that she ultimately disappeared.
It puts him in the area where her car was dumped.
He made mistakes. He made big mistakes.
During that search, we found some key pieces of evidence. We did find a roll of paper towels that matched exactly the print of the paper towel found inside the bag with Samira. But the biggest thing found at Littleton's house was that matching earring, the earring we'd been looking for.
That was a direct link between the victim, the scene, and the suspect.
Any doubt that I had, which wasn't much, was now eliminated. I knew that Zachary Littleton was our killer. Littleton's arrest took place at the Pensacola Naval Air Station. It was a really good feeling to know that this was going to be a case that we did resolve, and it wouldn't be one that would be hanging out as a cold case down the line.
I believe the night Samira Watkins went missing, she drove over to Zachary Littleton's apartment. At some point while she was there, he strangled her to death. He placed her body inside of the duffel bag. He drove her to the Naval Air Station. He threw her body in the water. He thought that he had gotten away with it, but then law enforcement was so quickly in touch with him, and that's why he started telling the lies that he did. My job prosecuting the case would have been much more difficult without the 2 interrogations, because the jurors would not have gotten to see Zachary Littleton's cold demeanor, his lack of concern for Samira, and the fact that he was lying in both interviews.
I don't know what to think.
You need to have. You need to.
I need to.
Yeah.
Zachary Littleton was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Justice was served.
This was such a tragic case and involved a young mother and her unborn child, and because of that, there was this special sense of desire to do justice for them.
Carl didn't show up to work, which was not like him at all. He never missed work. So people started calling, and of course they called me. Do you know where he's at? I was like, no. One of his friends started calling around and ended up calling the police.
When the Newton Falls Police Department arrived on scene, they did not notice any signs of forced entry. Everything looked okay, and they eventually contacted Carl's parents, and they made entry to the house.
The officer that went in immediately smelled a terrible odor. The odor was, in his mind, a dead person.
And then they found my brother.
We found Carl located at the bottom of the stairway, covered in a tarp and a comforter, with gunshot wounds.
How I found out was my oldest brother called me. Carl was a kind person, very patriotic, family-oriented person. Carl was in the military for roughly 25 years. He flew combat missions in Bosnia, and he flew missions over in the Middle East. And the C-130s, it's a big plane, it's kind of slow, so they're a target when they're up there. So it takes a special kind of pilot.
Everything we heard about him painted him as a good citizen, a contributing member of society, and a true victim.
From looking at the condition of the body, the estimate was he had been dead 2 or 3 days.
We discovered he had 3 gunshot wounds, 2 to the torso and 1 to the head. And the gunshot wound sustained to Carl's head was at close range.
It was obvious signs of foul play, instantly apparent. We were told that Claudia was originally from Brazil, that in the late 90s she moved to the U.S., became a naturalized U.S. citizen.
Carl met Claudia through Match.com, and he dated her for a couple months, and then for whatever reason, he decided to run off to Las Vegas and go get married. That was a little impulsive for him. 6 to 9 months into the marriage, he started expressing some concerns about being married to Claudia. He just said he wasn't happy with her and wanted to get away from her. I believe she was taking his money. That's what he believed. So he started talking to me about wanting to get divorced.
There were multiple efforts by the police and others to contact Claudia Herring. They could not connect with her.
Nobody really knew where she was, and so she was quickly a person of interest.
Investigators learned that Claudia had recently purchased a .357 Magnum at a local gun shop. We had also spoken to witnesses who told us that she had gone to a shooting range to practice shooting. Obviously, that raises some red flags.
It was very clear from the track of her phone that it was going to the Pittsburgh airport. From there, we found flight records that indicated she flew from Pittsburgh to New York, where she purchased a separate plane ticket to take her to Brazil. Within a matter of a couple months, we had Claudia located in Brazil. But based on Brazilian law and the Brazilian Constitution, they did not allow for their extradition of citizens to a foreign country, even if they're suspected of committing a crime such as homicide.
So the U.S. government, they just ran into a brick wall. Brazil just didn't want to cooperate. Claudia was just living freely, out in the open. Her belief was Brazil would never extradite her, so she just got away with murder. I was looking at a couple hours almost every night, corresponding with the embassy. I just really wasn't willing to give up.
That family never let go to the idea that anybody could get away with killing their son, their brother. Our case was in the late 90s. Claudia becomes an American citizen. She signs her documents taking allegiance with the United States of America and denying her loyalty to Brazil. That got us in the door. I said, I don't want her Brazilian ass, I want her American ass.
It was a huge relief to get her back. It was like a big block off my shoulders.
Out of the blue, just mid-flight, she says, you know, a wife doesn't kill her husband without a good reason. It put those of us on the plane in a really tenuous or unique position. We don't know enough about the case to question her. But on the other hand, we have no legal obligation to make her stop talking. And she spent the next couple hours of this flight telling the story that she wanted to have heard. Although I didn't have the facts of the case, I was in the unique position of, having sat on that plane with her for so long that we had a rapport. My role was just to try to keep her comfortable, to keep her talking. If she doesn't give this statement to us in this room on the video, now it's her word against ours. I felt more pressure or stress than I have in any other case. Knowing the seriousness of the crime and the amount of effort that so many people put in for so many years, we felt like we can't screw this up.
She told these guys everything on the plane, but now that the cameras are rolling, this is what counts.
Now, it's my understanding from what I hear that while you were on the plane right up here, you gave these guys a statement about what happened. That
Yeah, partial.
partial statement. Okay, great. But I kind of want to start at the beginning. I want to go back to March 15th, 2007.
Okay, you're gonna start from the end.
Well, yeah, well, the beginning of the end. Yes.
I start backwards. It's gonna start backwards. It's not fair.
I think, in fairness, I think what you had already talked to Tony and I about on the plane, I think that would be a very good place to start.
I feel like I'm under pressure to explain things. I didn't feel that way on the plane.
Right, and you're not going to be under any pressure. I'm not going to talk to you any differently now than
It's
we did
very
on
hard
the
not to
airplane.
feel
But
under pressure.
it's scary.
She viewed me as the good guy in the interview. She felt comfortable with me. So really, the only role I could play is the one I played, and that was to reassure her and to keep her talking.
I would like you to do this entirely of you. Just talk about the things that you talked about with us before, the things that you were already comfortable with.
This is where I started wondering, is this going to happen or isn't it? Can't force anybody to make a statement. If they ask for a lawyer, the interview's over. If they choose not to talk anymore, that's their constitutional right. Whether or not this interview takes place is solely her discretion.
No.
I think what is important is the couple of things that you said that led up to what happened that day, because she was reading a lot of things in the news and she wants to fill in those blanks of the things that weren't correct. Is that fair? Is that kind of how all this thing started?
Yeah.
Okay.
As soon as we got married, but I didn't want to be married to him. All of a sudden, he was a different person. He scared the life out of me. He treated me very, very bad. He was like very aggressive with me. He beat me. It was torture. He tortured me.
During the interview, Claudia was claiming to be a battered wife, which we found no evidence of.
What she was saying didn't match what the detectives were hearing from any of his friends, family, former girlfriends. In those cases where you have that type of abuse, there is always some type of corroboration. In her case, there was zero.
You just got through the hardest part. Okay? You're doing really well, and I think it's important. This is an important part of your story.
She needed to feel like she had somebody on her side, and it's difficult. You know the horrific thing they did, but you have to put that all aside and at least act like you're their friend, act like you believe them, because you want them to keep talking.
You really enlightened me when you were talking. I really want you to hear that. I really want you to hear what you told me.
I was pregnant, and he got very, very angry and he went crazy. He said, I never want to be a father. I never want to have children. I want a wife. I said, but I'm 40 years old. I can't. I'm not going to get an abortion. You will get an abortion.
One of the things that I noticed right away was how rehearsed everything she said seemed to be. There were a lot of statements that she made in the interview room that were just verbatim, just word for word what she had said on the plane. Even some of her hand movements. It was like she had been practicing this story, and that struck me as really odd.
After that, things started spiraling out of control, right?
Yeah. I had a plan. Doesn't want to accept this pregnancy. I'm gonna kill myself. What a good. I went to firing range, right? Because I want to shoot. They had to understand about the recorder.
I can't say that I've really been made aware ever of somebody who bought a gun or obtained a gun to commit suicide that went to the shooting range and practice. Here's the thing from the aspect of an interview. Sometimes a lie is more powerful than the truth.
We just had to let her keep talking because the more that she does that, the worse it is for her.
So I started drinking and I had a gun. What a gun.
No, you're on the right track. You're on the right track.
I was really nervous at that point.
Generally, there is only one time that person's going to sit across from us. This is basically your one chance.
So he got home and I said to him, forget it. I'm not gonna have an abortion. And he grabbed me. He threw me on bed and he grabbed my throat. I just defended myself. He was very angry and I already had this plan to commit suicide. He said, that's a very good idea, but just do me a favor. Go to the basement to do that because you're gonna splash my paintings. You're gonna splash blood all over my paintings.
I mean, basically, he just told you that his paintings are more important than you.
Yeah.
So you're pissed.
Yes.
What happened next?
Well, what happened next is that I got very angry and I got up real fast and I shot.
Shot what?
I shot at him and I was lying down.
Come back over here, please. Please.
Yeah, I was going. I got up real fast and I shot at him. He wasn't too far away. My plan was never, not for one single minute, to kill anybody but myself. Swear to God, there was not for a single minute I thought about it.
It was relief. She confessed to shooting him. Now Mike could ask the tough questions.
You were pregnant. What happened with that child?
I lost the baby.
You lost the baby in Brazil. Did you go to a hospital there or a doctor?
No, because I was afraid to give my name and be arrested. I was paranoid for that.
We did not believe her. We were never able to find any information to substantiate Claudia's claims of being pregnant.
I mean, after you shoot, you get your wits about you and you realize what just happened. Did you ever think about just calling the police?
Yes, I did, and I was. But my father said not because of the death penalty.
I guess probably the simplest question that we didn't ask. Instead of killing him, would have been easier to just get a divorce.
I tried, he wouldn't let me.
And what was his story? What was his answer?
I beg you, won't change. I love you, I love you. I can live with you, most beautiful woman in the world. I love you, I swear I'm gonna change.
I was sitting there thinking, how can anybody believe this? Right from the beginning, it felt like theatrics. I think her narcissism overshadowed her intelligence and common sense, and that when she walked out of that room, that she probably felt like a winner.
My personal belief is I think she wasn't real pleased that he had rejected her. He wanted to get divorced from her. I don't think she was used to that, and I think she was vindictive.
We, the jury in this case, duly impaneled and sworn or affirmed, find the defendant, Claudia C. Herrig, guilty of aggravated murder as he stands charged in the first count of the indictment, dated this date, signed by all 12 jurors.
Claudia was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 28 years because that was actually one of the stipulations to the extradition.
You cannot overestimate the value of interviews and confessions.
It got very green. I got up real fast and shocked.
It's instrumental to our convictions. The confession brought out her lies, which were contradicted by the evidence, which in my opinion is the best kind of evidence to have.
I was relieved. I don't take cases personally, at all, ever. But this case was so different that I was happy to see some closure for the Harry family.
The impact on my family was pretty big for that 11 years. Takes a lot out of you. It was a huge relief to finally get her convicted.
Tenacity pays off. Had it not been for the tenacity of the family, for the investigators involved, this case never would have come to a successful conclusion.
Justice is a journey. It doesn't end until it's done. We owed one last mission for Carl in his service to this country.
The fire was already dying when investigators realized the woman inside the vehicle had not died in the flames. The smoke was lifting into the cold mountain air. The metal was blackened. The glass was shattered. And inside the burned-out vehicle was the body of 26-year-old Marie Walkingstick Pheasant. December 29, 2013. Big Cove, the Qualla boundary, western North Carolina. At first glance, the scene looked like destruction. A vehicle consumed by fire, a body trapped inside, evidence reduced to ash. But beneath the wreckage was a fact that would change everything. Marie had not simply died in a fire. She had been murdered. Her body had suffered stab wounds to the neck and abdomen. The fire had come afterward. Someone had wanted the evidence destroyed. Someone had wanted the truth to disappear with the smoke. And for more than 10 years, the question would remain brutally simple. Who killed Marie Walkingstick Pheasant? The answer would eventually come from something almost absurdly ordinary. A baseball cap, a piece of clothing left behind near the burned vehicle. Something that could have been overlooked. Something that could have been dismissed as meaningless. But inside that cap was a biological trace. And years later, when investigators reopened the case, that trace would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the investigation. DNA would point toward the man who had once been Marie's husband, Ernest D. Pheasant Sr., but in December 2013, none of that was known. There was only fire. There was only a dead young woman. There was only a family staring into an investigation that seemed to have no ending. Marie was 26 years old. She was a member of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. She was a mother. She was a daughter, a sister, a relative, a friend. To investigators, she would eventually become the center of a homicide investigation. To the people who knew her, she was much more than the name printed on a cold case poster. And that distinction matters because cold cases have a way of turning human lives into photographs. A face on a flyer, a date, a location, a reward, a sentence that says someone knows something. But behind every one of those photographs is a life that once moved forward normally. Meals, conversations, arguments, plans, children, family gatherings, ordinary moments that nobody realizes are precious until one person suddenly disappears from them. The night before the discovery, something had happened that would eventually become the focus of investigators. According to the later prosecution, Marie had been killed before her body was taken to the location where the vehicle was burned. The government would ultimately establish that Ernest killed her at their home, transported her body to the vehicle, drove it toward Big Cove Road, and deliberately set the vehicle on fire. But in the early hours of the investigation, those facts were not yet established. Investigators were looking at a burned vehicle and trying to determine what had happened before the flames erased the scene. Fire changes everything. Heat destroys fingerprints. Smoke obscures surfaces. Flammes itamette. Biological evidence can be degraded. Objects are burned, melted, cracked, or displaced. A scene that was once a sequence of actions becomes a pile of fragments. Investigators must reconstruct what happened backward. Where was the vehicle before the fire? Who drove it? Who touched it? When did Marie die? Where did she die? Why was the vehicle burned? Was the fire meant to destroy evidence? Was someone trying to make the death look accidental? Was the person responsible still nearby? And then came the autopsy. Marie had not died because the vehicle burned. She had suffered fatal stab wounds. That single conclusion transformed the case. This was not a tragic fire. This was homicide. Someone had killed Marie and then tried to use fire to conceal the crime. The mountain community was forced to absorb the reality. A young Cherokee woman had been murdered. Her body had been placed inside a vehicle. The vehicle had been burned, and the person responsible had vanished into the same world where Marie had lived. For the family, the nightmare was only beginning. The investigation moved forward, but the answers did not come quickly. No dramatic confession arrived at the door. No eyewitness stepped forward with the perfect account. No single piece of evidence immediately revealed the killer. The case entered the difficult territory where investigators can know a crime occurred but cannot prove who committed it. The years began to accumulate. 1 year. Then another. Then another. Marie's photograph remained associated with the word that families of murdered people dread most. Cold case. A case can become cold without becoming forgotten. Those are not the same thing. Cold means the immediate trail has gone quiet. It does not mean the victim has stopped matching. It does not mean investigators stop thinking about the evidence. It does not mean the family stops waiting. And Marie's family waited. The case remained in the memory of the community. Her name appeared in cold case efforts connected to missing and murdered Indigenous people. A reward was offered for information leading to an arrest and conviction. Public appeals continued. Somewhere, investigators believed there might be a person who knew what happened. Someone might have seen something, heard something, remembered something that seemed insignificant in 2013 but could become decisive years later. That is the strange mathematics of a cold case. Time destroys evidence, but time can also expose it. Technology changes. Databases expand. Investigators change. Old files are reviewed. And evidence that once seemed silent can suddenly speak. For Marie's family, however, time did not feel like progress. It felt like distance. Every birthday became another birthday without her. Every family gathering carried an absence. Every year without an arrest raised the same terrible possibility that whoever killed Marie might never face justice. Then, years later, the case moved again. Not because the fire had suddenly revealed something. Not because a new eyewitness appeared out of nowhere. But because investigators went back. On April 7th, 2022, the Bureau of Indian Affairs Missing and Murdered Unit opened a full interagency investigation after reviewing unsolved homicides in the region. The renewed effort brought together agencies that could examine the old case from a new perspective. The FBI, the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, the North Carolina State Highway Patrol, the Cherokee Indian Police Department, the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians Office of the Tribal Prosecutor. Different agencies, different resources. One question: who killed Marie Walkingstick Pheasant? The file that had once been buried beneath years of silence was opened again. And somewhere inside that file was the baseball cap. A simple object. A cap recovered near the burned vehicle. An object that had survived the fire. An object carrying biological evidence. DNA. The kind of evidence that does not care how much time has passed. The kind of evidence that does not become intimidated by silence. The kind of evidence that can sit unnoticed for years and then, under the right circumstances, turn a mystery into a name. The investigators did not have to know exactly what the killer had been thinking when the cap was left behind. They only had to determine whose biological material was on it. Testing linked the DNA from the baseball cap to Ernest D. Pheasant, Marie's estranged husband. Suddenly, the decade-long investigation had a direction. But DNA alone does not tell an entire story. It does not automatically explain when the biological material was deposited. It does not narrate murder. It does not tell investigators what happened inside a home, inside a vehicle, or along a mountain road. It provides a connection. Investigators then had to build the rest. The relationship between Marie and Ernest became critical. The circumstances surrounding the marriage, their separation, their interactions, the events leading up to December 29th, 2013, the movement of Marie's body, the vehicle, the fire, the evidence that had survived. And eventually, the case became much larger than a burned vehicle beside a road. It became a reconstruction, a sequence of events, a chain. And investigators began connecting the links. The prosecution would later say that Ernest killed Marie at their home before moving her body to the vehicle. He then drove the vehicle to the Big Cove area and set it on fire. The purpose, prosecutors said, was to destroy evidence of the murder. For more than a decade, the public had seen only the aftermath. The burned vehicle, the body, the silence. Now investigators were reconstructing what had happened before the flames. In November 2023, nearly 10 years after Marie's death, Ernest D. Pheasant was arrested. The word cold case suddenly disappeared from the headlines. Marie's photograph was no longer attached only to a plea for information. There was a suspect. There was a federal case. There was an investigation that had crossed a decade of silence. And there was something else. The suspect was not a stranger who had appeared from nowhere. He was Marie's estranged husband, the man whose DNA had been recovered from the baseball cap near the burned vehicle. The arrest was not the end. It was the moment when the old mystery entered a courtroom. The case that had begun with fire now moved into a different kind of arena. Evidence would be examined. Allegations would be tested. Prosecutors would have to establish what happened. The defense would have the opportunity to respond. And Marie's family would once again have to live through the details of her death. There is a particular cruelty in that part of a cold case. For years, families wait for answers. Then the answers come. And they are often painful. The renewed investigation alleged a sequence of violence that was far more deliberate than the burned vehicle alone suggested. The earlier tribal charges had included homicide, tampering with evidence, domestic violence and dating violence, witness tampering, and possession of firearms by a prohibited person. The federal indictment later charged Ernest with first-degree murder in Indian country. The case was no longer a mystery in the abstract. It had a defendant. It had evidence. It had a prosecution. And it had a victim whose name had waited more than a decade to be spoken in court. But there was still one more question. Would Ernest Pheasant fight the case? The answer came in August 2024. He did not. On August 16, 2024, Ernest D. Pheasant Sr. pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in Indian country. The confession changed the meaning of the baseball cap. For years, the DNA had been a clue. Now it was part of the evidence in a case that had reached a guilty plea. The man prosecutors accused of killing Marie admitted that he had murdered her willfully, deliberately, maliciously, and with premeditation. More than 10 years after the fire, the legal question of who was responsible had been answered. But justice is not the same thing as restoration. Nothing could return Marie to her children. Nothing could erase the years her family had spent without an answer. Nothing could undo the image of the burned vehicle. Nothing could reconstruct the ordinary future that had disappeared with her. The guilty plea could establish responsibility. It cannot reverse time. And that is what makes cold cases so haunting. They're not only about the moment a crime occurred. They're about everything that continues afterward. A family grows older. Children grow up. People move away. Buildings change. Roads change. Technology changes. Investigators retire. Memories fade. But the question remains, what happened? For Marie's family, that question lasted more than 10 years. And the object that helped break the silence was not some spectacular piece of futuristic technology. It was a baseball cap, an ordinary object, found near an extraordinary crime. The cap had no voice. It could not tell investigators what it had seen. It could not explain who wore it. It could not describe the night. But its biological evidence endured. The fire had destroyed much of the scene. It had not destroyed everything. That distinction became decisive. And on April 3rd, 2025, Ernest D. Pheasant Sr. was sentenced to life in federal prison. The courtroom chapter had reached its final page. The man responsible for Marie's murder had been held accountable. But the story of Marie Walkingstick Pheasant cannot end with the sentence. Because a sentence describes what happened to the person who committed the crime, it does not fully describe what happened to the person who died. Marie was 26. She had a family. She had children. She had a community. She had a future. That future was taken from her. The fire was supposed to erase evidence. Instead, it became the beginning of a trail that would survive for more than a decade. The investigators who reopened the case did not have the luxury of a fresh crime scene. They had an old file, old evidence, old memories, old questions. They had to reconstruct a case that had been waiting in silence. And eventually, the evidence spoke. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Not with a confession. With DNA. A biological signature hidden on a baseball cap. That is the unsettling lesson of the Marie Walkingstick Pheasant case. A crime scene can burn. A witness can disappear. A memory can weaken. A decade can pass. But evidence can wait. It can remain in an evidence room. It can remain inside a file. It can remain in a database. And sometimes, years later, someone opens the case again. Someone asks the question one more time. Someone tests the evidence one more time. And the silence breaks. For Marie, the silence lasted from December 29th, 2013, until the investigation finally produced an arrest in 2023, a guilty plea in 2024, and a life sentence in 2025. More than 10 years separated the crime from the final punishment. 10 years of uncertainty. 10 years of unanswered questions. 10 years during which the word cold could have suggested that the case was finished. It was not. Because cold does not mean dead. It means waiting. And sometimes, the smallest surviving trace is enough to make the past come alive again. The mountains had seen the fire. The road had seen the burned vehicle. The community had seen Marie's photograph. Her family had lived with the absence. Investigators had lived with the unanswered questions. And somewhere inside that history was a baseball cap, a silent object, a forgotten object, an object carrying DNA. More than 10 years after Marie Walkingstick Pheasant was murdered, that DNA helped point investigators toward the man responsible. The fire had failed. The years had failed. The silence had failed. Marie's case did not disappear. It waited. And when investigators finally returned to it, the evidence was still there, waiting to speak, waiting to connect the past to the present, waiting to put a name where there had once been only a question. And in the end, that name was Ernest D. Pheasant Sr. The name was no longer a question, but the evidence still demanded to be understood. Because finding a suspect is one thing. Understanding how a murder survived 10 years without an answer is something else entirely. And the deeper investigators went into Marie Walking Stick Pheasant's final days, the more the case revealed about the danger of ordinary places, familiar people, and evidence that can remain invisible until someone knows where to look. Marie's death did not happen in some abandoned building at the edge of an unknown city. It happened within the orbit of a relationship, within a world where people knew one another, where faces were familiar, where the person eventually accused was not an anonymous stranger, but a man connected to Marie through marriage. That fact changes the emotional landscape of a homicide. A stranger can be frightening, but familiarity can be deceptive. The people closest to a victim often know their routines. They know where they sleep. They know which doors are locked. They know what vehicles they use. They know who they call. They know which arguments matter and which ones will be forgotten by morning. And when something terrible happens, those ordinary details become evidence. Investigators eventually had to examine the relationship between Marie and Ernest Pheasant through the cold, unforgiving lens of a homicide investigation. Every interaction mattered. Every timeline mattered. Every unexplained movement mattered. The question was no longer simply who could have killed Marie. It became more precise. Who had the opportunity? Who had access? Who had a reason? Who could explain the movement of her body? Who could explain the burned vehicle? And most importantly, whose evidence remained at the scene? For years, the answer to those questions had been incomplete. Then the baseball cap became important. The cap was not dramatic. There was no blood-soaked weapon sitting inside it. No handwritten confession. No message from the killer. Just biological material. DNA. A microscopic trace capable of surviving where memories failed. That is what makes forensic evidence so powerful in a cold case. It does not need to remember the crime. It only needs to preserve a connection. But investigators still had to be careful. DNA can establish that a person's biological material was present. It does not automatically explain the circumstances. It does not say, I committed this crime. Investigators have to combine it with other evidence. That is exactly what the renewed investigation attempted to do. The case was reopened in 2022. More than 8 years had passed since Marie's death. The original investigation was no longer fresh. The witnesses were older. Memories had changed. Some details might have disappeared entirely. But the physical evidence remained. And modern investigators were looking at it with tools that were more advanced than those available when the crime first occurred. This is where cold case investigations become almost archaeological. Investigators de bakvad. They examine old reports. They revisit photographs. They review interviews. They re-examine evidence. They compare old information with databases and newer forensic technology. They ask questions that may not have been asked correctly the first time. And sometimes, the most important breakthrough comes not from new evidence, but from an old piece of evidence finally being interpreted correctly. The DNA recovered from the baseball cap became a critical part of that process. Its connection to Ernest Pheasant gave investigators something they had not possessed before, a direct forensic link. But the case did not move forward in a vacuum. The agencies involved brought different forms of expertise to the investigation. Federal investigators became involved. The North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation examined the case. The North Carolina State Highway Patrol became part of the effort. The Cherokee Indian Police Department was involved. The Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians Office of the Tribal Prosecutor contributed to the investigation. The case had become larger than one agency. That mattered because Marie's murder existed within a broader national problem involving missing and murdered Indigenous people. Across the United States, families of Indigenous victims have repeatedly faced the agony of disappearances and unsolved killings. Geography can complicate investigations. Jurisdiction can become complicated. Resources can be limited. And when a case grows old, those complications can become even harder to overcome. Marie's case eventually demonstrated what can happen when investigators return to an old homicide with renewed resources and renewed attention. But there was still a human dimension that no laboratory could solve. Marie's family had already lived through the worst part, the waiting. There is no dramatic soundtrack to waiting. There is no breaking news banner. There is only the passage of days, then months, then years. At first, every phone call can feel important. A new lead, a new investigator, a possible witness, a piece of information. Then the calls become less frequent. The headlines disappear. The public moves on. But the family does not. For them, the case remains active every morning they wake up. Marie does not become a cold case inside her family. She remains a daughter, a mother, a sister, a person whose chair is empty, a photograph that remains familiar even as everyone around it grows older. That is the part of homicide investigations that statistics cannot capture. A case number can be closed. A family cannot be closed. And when the federal investigation finally moved toward an arrest, the family had to confront another reality. Justice would require them to revisit the nightmare. The name Ernest D. Pheasant Sr. became public. The man prosecutors said was responsible for Marie's murder was arrested in November 2023. The decade of uncertainty had suddenly transformed into a criminal proceeding. For the public, this was a headline. For investigators, it was the culmination of years of work. For Marie's family, it was something much more complicated. Relief, grief, anger, shock, and the painful knowledge that the person accused was someone connected to Marie's own life. The arrest also created a new question. Would the evidence survive the courtroom? A cold case can produce an arrest and still fail to produce a conviction. Prosecutors have to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. Evidence has to be admissible. Witnesses have to testify. Forensic findings have to be explained. The story that investigators had reconstructed had to become a legal case. The federal government alleged that Ernest killed Marie at their home and then attempted to conceal the murder by transporting her body and burning the vehicle. The details were devastating. The fire was no longer viewed simply as an unexplained event. It was alleged to be part of the concealment. That distinction matters. A fire can be an accident. A fire can be a tragedy. But investigators believe this fire had a purpose. Destroy the evidence. Change the scene. Erase the past. Make it harder to determine what happened. Except the evidence was not completely erased. The cap survived. The DNA survived. And the investigation survived. More than a decade after Marie's death, the old evidence had become a bridge between 2013 and the courtroom. Then came August 2024. The case that had spent years without a definitive answer reached a dramatic turning point. Ernest Pheasant pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in Indian country. There would be no prolonged trial. No jury would have to decide whether the government had proven its case. The defendant admitted responsibility. The man whose DNA had been linked to the baseball cap was now formally acknowledging that he had murdered Marie. The plea did not erase the investigation. It confirmed where the investigation had led, and it transformed the meaning of every year that came before it. For 10 years, the case had been a question. It became a name, then a charge, then a guilty plea, and eventually a sentence, life in federal prison. On April 3rd, 2025, Ernest D. Pheasant Sr. was sentenced to life imprisonment. The legal system had reached its conclusion, but the story of the evidence remains extraordinary. Because investigators did not solve this case through one spectacular discovery. They solved it through persistence, through collaboration, through reopening evidence, through forensic testing, through the willingness to examine a case that had already consumed years without producing an answer, and through one small object that had remained behind: a baseball cap. It is easy to imagine crime scenes as places filled with obvious clues. A weapon, a fingerprint, a surveillance caméra, a confession. Reality is rarely so clean. Evidence can be microscopic. It can be accidental. It can be something a suspect never realized he left behind. A strand of hair, a cell phone record, a show impression, a fragment, a biological trace, or DNA on a cap. The killer does not have to intend to leave evidence. He only has to leave it, and time cannot always erase it. That is why the Marie walking-stick pheasant case became more than a story about a murder. It became a story about the persistence of evidence. The fire was powerful, but it was not absolute. The years were long, but they were not infinite. The case became cold, but it was never truly dead. Somewhere in an evidence room, a file continued to exist. Somewhere in the records, Marie's name remained. Somewhere in the physical evidence, a biological trace waited for technology and investigators to catch up with it. And when they did, the past moved. The silence broke. The investigation changed direction. A family received an answer they had been waiting for since 2013. But there is a darker question buried beneath that resolution. What if the case had never been reopened? What if investigators had not returned to the old evidence? What if the baseball cap had remained untouched? What if the DNA had never been tested against the relevant databases? What if nobody had looked again? The answer is uncomfortable. The mystery might have lasted even longer. Perhaps decades. Perhaps forever. That is the reality of cold cases. Justice can depend on someone deciding that an old case is not an old problem. It is an unfinished problem. Marie's murder remained unfinished until investigators chose to examine it again. That choice changed everything. The mountain roads did not reveal the killer. The burned vehicle did not reveal the killer. The passage of time did not reveal the killer. The answer came through evidence. And evidence does not get tired. It does not become discouraged. It does not forget. It waits. The final years of Marie's case, therefore, carry a strange contradiction. The investigation ended with certainty. But the circumstances surrounding her death remain horrifying precisely because they began in the ordinary world. A relationship. A home. A vehicle. A road. A baseball cap. Nothing about those objects looks like the beginning of a murder investigation. Yet every one of them became part of the story. That is why the case continues to resonate. Not because the killer escaped forever. He did not. Not because Marie disappeared without ever being found. She was found. Not because the family never received justice. They eventually did. The haunting part is the distance between the crime and the answer. More than 10 years. More than a decade during which the truth remained buried beneath uncertainty. More than 10 years before the evidence finally connected the past to the man responsible. And when that connection came, it did not arrive with thunder. It arrived quietly. A laboratory result. A DNA match. A name. That is sometimes how justice returns. Not with a dramatic confession in the middle of the night. Not with a killer suddenly appearing at a police station. But through a piece of evidence that has been silent for years. Waiting for someone to ask it the right question. And in Marie Walking-Stick Pheasant's case, the question was finally asked. Who left this biological evidence behind? The answer pointed to Ernest D. Pheasant Sr. And once that answer emerged, the decade-long silence began to collapse. The fire had not erased everything. It had only hidden the truth. For a while. But the most disturbing part of the case was not the moment investigators discovered the DNA. It was what that discovery forced them to reconsider. For years, the burned vehicle had been the dominant image. Fire, smoke, metal, ash, a body inside. The scene seemed to begin and end there. But once investigators had reason to believe Ernest D. Pheasant was connected to the evidence, the burned vehicle could no longer be viewed as the beginning of the story. It was the final stage of something that had already happened. That meant investigators had to move backward. Before the flames. Before the road. Before the smoke. Before Marie's body was found. The question became brutally direct. Where had Marie been killed? The federal case would eventually establish that she had been killed at the home she shared with Ernest. According to the prosecution, the murder was deliberate. Marie suffered stab wounds to her neck and abdomen. Her body was then moved. The vehicle was driven toward the Big Cove area. And there, prosecutors said the vehicle was deliberately set on fire. The fire was not the murder. It was the attempt to hide the murder. That distinction gave the investigation an entirely different shape. A burned vehicle can conceal evidence, but it can also create evidence. Fire leaves patterns. Movement leaves traces. And a person trying to destroy evidence can make mistakes. The investigators who reopened Marie's case had to look at those mistakes one by one. The original scene was more than a decade old, yet the evidence still contained a story. The challenge was translating physical objects into a sequence of events. The vehicle had been burned. Marie had been stabbed. Her body had been placed inside. The vehicle had been moved. A baseball cap had remained nearby. And, eventually, DNA linked the cap to Ernest. Every fact by itself might have been incomplete. Together, they began forming a chain. That chain mattered because the justice system does not operate on atmosphere. Suspicion is not enough. A person cannot be convicted simply because investigators believe he was capable of committing a crime. There must be evidence. There must be a connection between the accused and the crime. There must be a timeline. There must be a reason to believe that the evidence tells the same story. In Marie's case, prosecutors eventually argued that it did. And as the investigation progressed, another painful truth emerged. Marie had not been randomly selected by an unknown killer wandering through the mountains. The prosecution's case centered on a relationship that made the crime more intimate, more disturbing, and more difficult for those who had known Marie. When a stranger commits a violent act, people often imagine the danger coming from somewhere outside their world. But domestic violence destroys that illusion. The danger can exist behind a familiar door. It can exist inside a relationship. It can exist in the space where a person expects to be safest. And when the victim is murdered, the people left behind have to confront an unbearable possibility that someone they knew may have been responsible. For Marie's family, the passage from uncertainty to certainty therefore came with a terrible cost. The answer was not an abstract name. It was a person. A person connected to her life. A person who had shared a marriage with her. A person whose DNA would eventually become a critical part of the investigation. That revelation can change how families remember the past. Old conversations acquire new meaning. Old arguments acquire new meaning. Places that once seemed ordinary can become unbearable. A home can become a crime scene in memory long after investigators have left. A road can become a reminder. A photograph can become painful to look at. And yet Marie herself must not disappear beneath the details of the crime. She was not born a cold case. She did not begin as a murder victim. She began as a person. She lived. She loved. She raised children. She belonged to a community. She had relationships that existed long before investigators wrote reports about her death. The crime took her future. It did not define the whole of her life. That distinction becomes especially important in cases involving Indigenous victims, because many families have spent years fighting not only for justice, but also for recognition. A murdered person can become a statistic. A missing person can become a poster. A case can become a number. But Marie had a name. Marie Walkingstick Pheasant. That name became part of a much larger conversation about missing and murdered Indigenous people. Her case demonstrated why cold case investigations remain important even after years have passed. It demonstrated how evidence can cross institutional boundaries. And it demonstrated the importance of federal and tribal cooperation in a case occurring within Indian country. The investigators did not have the luxury of pretending the past had been preserved perfectly. It had not. They had to work with what remained. That is the reality of forensic investigation. Evidence is never a magical answer. It is a puzzle. And sometimes pieces of that puzzle have been damaged. Sometimes pieces are missing. Sometimes the picture is incomplete. But investigators keep working. They compare. They test. They verify. They challenge their assumptions. They ask whether the evidence really supports the conclusion. And when the pieces align, the picture becomes clearer. In Marie's case, the picture eventually became impossible to ignore. The baseball cap connected Ernest to the scene. The circumstances connected him to Marie. The investigation connected the physical evidence to the broader timeline. And the prosecution built a case that ultimately ended with a guilty plea. But imagine the emotional weight of that moment. For years, Marie's family had lived with a question. Now the question had an answer, and the answer was devastating. There is a common misconception that solving a murder brings an immediate sense of peace. Sometimes it brings something more complicated. It can bring relief. But relief does not mean happiness. Justice does not mean closure in the simple sense. A guilty plea cannot bring someone back. A life sentence cannot restore childhood memories. A federal court cannot return the years that were stolen. What it can do is establish accountability. It can place responsibility where it belongs. It can create a permanent legal record. And it can tell the family that the person responsible will not simply disappear into history. That matters. Because for more than a decade, the opposite possibility had existed. That the killer might remain unidentified. That the evidence might never be enough. That Marie's death might remain another unresolved case. But the case did not stay unresolved. The investigation continued. The evidence survived. And the suspect was eventually arrested. When Ernest Pheasant pleaded guilty in August 2024, the uncertainty surrounding the identity of Marie's killer ended. Then came the sentencing. April 3rd, 2025. Life in federal prison. The sentence was the final legal consequence of a crime that had begun more than 11 years earlier. 11 years. Think about what happens in 11 years. Children grow. People age. Communities change. Technology transforms. Entire generations can pass through classrooms. A decade can make one photograph look old. But Marie's case remained connected to one night in 2013. That is the strange nature of time in homicide investigations. For everyone else, time moves forward. For the family, part of time remains trapped at the moment the phone rings. The moment someone says there has been a fire. The moment they learn Marie is dead. The moment they realize the death was not accidental. The moment they begin asking who did it. That moment never truly disappears. And yet, investigators eventually managed to move the case forward. The reopened investigation showed that a case does not have to remain frozen simply because it is old. The evidence can be retested. The questions can be reconsidered. The technology can improve. The people working the case can change. And sometimes the truth is still waiting inside the evidence. This is why the baseball cap matters so much. It was not a dramatic object. It was not the kind of evidence that makes headlines when it is first recovered. But it endured. The killer may have believed the fire would erase the past. The fire did not. The biological evidence remained. And DNA has a peculiar power. It is personal. It is microscopic. It is difficult to see. But under laboratory analysis, it can become extraordinarily specific. A tiny trace can point investigators toward a person. A person can lead investigators toward a relationship. A relationship can reveal motive and opportunity. And those pieces can become a criminal case. That is the path this investigation ultimately followed. Not a straight line. A long, winding road. A trail interrupted by years. But still a trail. The most haunting image is therefore not necessarily the burned vehicle. It may be the evidence left beside it. A capítulo. Something ordinary. Something that did not burn away. Something that remained after the flames disappeared. Something that carried the future answer inside it. There's almost an irony in that. The crime was built around destruction. The evidence was built around survival. The killer allegedly tried to destroy the scene. But destruction is rarely complete. A fire consumes. It does not understand. It cannot distinguish between evidence and garbage. It destroys what it reaches. But sometimes something survives at the edge. A fragment. A surface. A biological trace. And that fragment can become the bridge to the truth. More than 10 years later, that bridge led investigators to Ernest D. Pheasant Sr. By then, the investigation had changed completely. The case was no longer only about identifying a killer. It was about reconstructing Marie's final hours. It was about establishing how the murder happened. It was about proving that the fire was part of an attempt to conceal the crime. And it was about ensuring that the evidence could withstand scrutiny. The guilty plea meant the courtroom would not need to hear every detail through a full trial. But the evidence had already done its work. The DNA had helped identify the suspect. The investigation had connected the suspect to the crime. The federal prosecution had established the charge. And the guilty plea acknowledged responsibility. There was no longer a mystery over who had killed Marie. But there remained a permanent mystery that no courtroom could answer. What would Marie's life have looked like if she had survived? No forensic laboratory can answer that. No DNA test can reconstruct a future. No sentence can restore it. That is the invisible loss behind every homicide. The future disappears alongside the victim. Every plan that was never completed. Every conversation that never happened. Every birthday that came after the death. Every photograph that will always contain one missing person. That is why the final chapter of a murder case should never belong entirely to the killer. It should belong to the victim. Marie Walkingstick Pheasant was 26 years old when her life ended. For more than 10 years, the public knew her primarily through the circumstances of her death. But the investigation eventually gave her story something it had lacked for years. An answer. The answer did not arrive quickly. It did not arrive easily. It did not arrive before the family had endured years of uncertainty. But it arrived. And that is the central lesson buried inside this cold case. A case can become cold without becoming forgotten. A crime can become old without becoming impossible to solve. Evidence can become ancient without becoming useless. And sometimes the smallest trace can survive the longest silence. The baseball cap did not speak in 2013. It did not speak in 2014. It did not speak in 2015. Year after year, it remained silent. But silence is not the same as absence. The evidence was still there, waiting. And when investigators returned in 2022, the questions changed. The technology had changed. The investigation changed. The evidence was examined again. And the silence finally broke. Marie's name could finally be separated from the word unknown. Her killer had a name. Her case had a conclusion. Her family had an answer. And the man responsible would spend the rest of his life in federal prison. More than 10 years after the fire, the truth had finally emerged from what was left behind. Not from the flames. From what the flames failed to destroy. But even after the guilty plea, even after the sentence, there was one thing that remained impossible to reconstruct: the exact emotional landscape of those final hours before Marie Walkingstick Pheasant died. Investigators could establish a sequence. Prosecutors could present evidence. A court could impose punishment. But no report could fully capture what Marie experienced as her ordinary life became a nightmare. That is the hidden territory of every homicide investigation. The evidence tells investigators what happened. The victim is the only person who could have told them what it felt like. And Marie could no longer speak. So investigators had to reconstruct her final hours from everything that remained. A timeline. A vehicle. A residence. Physical evidence. Statements. Records. And eventually, the DNA. Piece by piece, the last chapter of Marie's life could be assembled. But it would never be complete in the way a living witness can make a story complete. There would always be gaps. Always unanswered emotional questions. Always moments that belonged only to Marie. That is what makes the passage of time so cruel in a case like this. The longer investigators wait, the more information disappears. People forget. Places change. Objects are moved. Memories become contaminated by later conversations. A witness may remember an event differently after hearing what investigators believe happened. And yet, when the Marie Walkingstick Pheasant case was reopened, investigators did not begin with nothing. They began with a foundation. An old case file. Old evidence. Old photographs. Old reports. And the knowledge that somewhere inside that material was the possibility of an answer. The investigation into Marie's death was not merely an attempt to find a person to blame. It was an attempt to reconstruct an event that had been deliberately obscured. That distinction is critical. According to the federal case, the fire was part of the concealment. Someone had attempted to make the scene difficult to interpret. The body had been moved. The vehicle had been burned. The original circumstances of the killing were separated from the location where Marie was ultimately discovered. That created layers. Investigators had to determine what happened first. Then what happened next? Then what happened after that? A homicide is a sequence. A crime scene is a frozen moment. When the body is moved, the scene becomes misleading. When the vehicle is burned, the evidence becomes fragmented. When years pass, the investigation becomes a reconstruction of a reconstruction. But investigators kept going. They examined the physical evidence. They pursued the DNA. And they began narrowing the possibilities. The baseball cap became one of the critical links. A cap can be handled casually, worn in a vehicle, left behind, picked up, dropped, forgotten. But biological evidence does not care whether an object seems important. Skin cells can remain. Hair can remain. Other biological material can remain. And when investigators later examined that evidence with modern forensic methods, the object can suddenly become important. That is what happened here. The cap helped connect Ernest D. Pheasant Sr. to the crime. For investigators, that connection mattered because Ernest was not simply a random individual whose DNA appeared in an unrelated location. He was Marie's estranged husband. The relationship gave the DNA context. And context is what transforms a forensic result into an investigative lead. Imagine the difference. Without context, investigators have DNA. With context, they have a person connected to the victim, a person whose relationship with the victim can be examined, a person whose movements can be investigated, a person whose statements can be compared against the physical evidence. Suddenly, the case begins moving. The cold case becomes active again. The old evidence becomes relevant again. The victim's name begins appearing in investigative briefings again. And the people who had waited for years begin hearing something they had almost stopped expecting. Progress. But progress in a murder investigation is rarely simple. Every new lead creates new questions. If Ernest's DNA was on the cap, how did it get there? Where had the cap been? When had it been worn? What was the timeline? What happened inside the home? What happened to Marie's body? What happened to the vehicle? Why was it burned? Was the fire intended to destroy evidence? And if so, what evidence was someone trying to eliminate? The investigation had to answer those questions without relying on speculation. That is where forensic science becomes both powerful and limited. DNA can tell investigators that biological material is associated with an individual. It cannot automatically tell them the entire story. A DNA match is a piece of evidence. It becomes powerful when it fits with other pieces. That is why cold case investigators often spend months or years building around a single forensic breakthrough. The laboratory can produce a result in a relatively short period. The investigation may take much longer. Because the question is not simply, whose DNA is this? The question is, what does this DNA mean in the context of this crime? For Marie's case, investigators had to place the DNA within the larger sequence. And the larger sequence was devastating. The federal prosecution ultimately alleged that Ernest killed Marie at their home. Her body was then moved. The vehicle was driven toward the Big Cove area, and the vehicle was set on fire. The crime, therefore, involved two distinct stages: the killing, then the concealment. That distinction helps explain why the burned vehicle was such a difficult starting point. Anyone arriving at the scene would naturally focus on the fire. But the fire was potentially the final act. The real crime had already occurred somewhere else. Investigators had to work backward from destruction. And working backward from destruction is one of the hardest tasks in forensic investigation. The fire removes information. It alters evidence. It can create false impressions. A burned vehicle can look like the scene of an accident. But the autopsy told investigators something different. Marie had suffered stab wounds. Her death was a homicide. The flames had not killed the investigation. They had transformed it. And perhaps that was the fatal mistake made by the person who tried to destroy the evidence. The fire created a new crime scene. A scene investigators could study. A location. A vehicle. A body. A collection of surviving objects. And among those objects was the baseball cap. The smallest surviving clue would eventually become one of the most important. Years passed. The community continued living. Children grew older. People changed jobs. Families moved. The landscape changed. But the question remained: who killed Marie? Then the Bureau of Indian Affairs Missing and Murdered Unit became involved. The renewed investigation brought federal attention and additional investigative resources. The case was no longer sitting quietly in an old archive. It was being worked. That matters. Because the difference between an unsolved case and a solved case is sometimes not a spectacular new clue. Sometimes it is simply the decision to look again. A case is reopened because someone believes the evidence still has something to say. And in Marie's case, it did. The renewed investigation eventually produced an arrest in November 2023. By then, Marie had been dead for almost 11 years. Almost 11 years. That is a lifetime for a child. An entire childhood can pass in 11 years. A person can enter elementary school and graduate before a cold case is solved. A family can experience weddings, births, illnesses, funerals, and ordinary mornings while one question remains untouched. What happened to Marie? The arrest answered part of that question, but it also forced the family to confront another. Why? Why did this happen? Why did the person responsible choose violence? Why was Marie's life taken? Why was her body burned? Some questions can be answered in court. Others remain beyond the reach of evidence. A guilty plea can establish responsibility. It cannot explain every emotion that preceded the crime. It cannot reveal every thought inside the killer's mind. And perhaps that is one of the hardest truths about justice. Justice can determine who is responsible. It cannot always explain everything. When Ernest pleaded guilty in August 2024, he admitted to first-degree murder in Indian country. The years of uncertainty were over. There would be no trial in which the family would have to listen to every piece of evidence presented before a jury. No prolonged courtroom battle over whether the prosecution could prove its case. The guilty plea provided an admission of responsibility. But for Marie's family, the moment could not simply be reduced to legal terminology. The word guilty carries enormous weight. It means the person responsible has been identified. It means the investigation reached its destination. It means the victim's family no longer has to wonder whether the killer will ever be found. But it also confirms the horror. The person they feared was responsible really was. There is no more comforting uncertainty. There is only truth. And sometimes truth hurts more than not knowing. Yet families of homicide victims often say that uncertainty is its own form of suffering. Without an answer, the mind creates possibilities. Every possibility is painful. Every unknown becomes another wound. Who did it? Why? Was Marie afraid? Did she know the person responsible? Could the crime have been prevented? Could someone have intervened? Could the investigation have moved faster? Questions multiply when there is no conclusion. The guilty plea could not answer all of them, but it could close the most important one. Who was responsible? Ernest de Fiancenseur, the name that emerged from the investigation, the name connected to the DNA, the name attached to the federal charge, the name that eventually appeared beneath a life sentence. And that sentence arrived on April 3rd, 2025. Life in federal prison. The courtroom had spoken. But outside the courtroom, Marie's story continued to exist in the people who remembered her. That is where a victim truly survives. Not in evidence bags. Not in case numbers. Not in courtroom transcripts. In memory. In photographs. In family stories. In the people who still say her name. And perhaps that is why the details of the case matter. Because without the details, Marie risks becoming another headline. Another statistic. Another cold case that was eventually solved. But she was never just a case. She was a 26-year-old woman whose life ended violently. She was a mother whose children had to grow up without her. She was a member of a community that had already seen too many cases of violence against indigenous people. And she was someone whose family refused to let her disappearance from the world become permanent. The investigation may have ended. The memory did not. Years from now, the forensic details may become less familiar. The date may fade. The location may fade. The names of the agencies involved may fade. But the central image remains. A young woman's life ended. A vehicle burned. A community waited. A family searched for answers. A baseball cap carried DNA. And more than a decade later, the evidence finally pointed toward the truth. There is something almost haunting about the fact that the most important clue did not change. The investigators changed. The technology changed. The years changed. The case changed. But the evidence remained. It waited through the silence. That is the strange endurance of forensic evidence. It does not need anyone to believe in it. It simply exists. And when the right question is asked, it can transform an old mystery. That is exactly what happened with Marie Walkingstick Pheasant. The investigation did not erase the years that had passed. It did not restore the lost time. It did not undo the violence. But it prevented the final outcome from being silence. Marie received an answer. Her family received accountability. And the person responsible received a sentence that will last for the rest of his life. The fire had once seemed like the final image of the case. It was not. The final image is something quieter. A case file reopened. A forensic sample tested. A DNA result examined. A name identified. An arrest made. A guilty plea entered. A sentence imposed. And somewhere behind all of those legal words is the person at the center of the story. Marie. The woman whose life was reduced to a mystery for more than 10 years. The woman whose murder became a cold case. The woman whose name remained in the records when the investigation went quiet. The woman whose story ultimately proved that a cold case is not necessarily a dead case. Because sometimes the truth does not disappear. Sometimes it simply waits. And sometimes, after 10 years of silence, it is hidden inside something as ordinary as a baseball cap, waiting for the day someone finally looks closely enough to see it. But there was another layer to the story that could not be measured in DNA probabilities or courtroom documents. It was the passage of time itself. More than a decade had separated the night Marie Walkingstick Pheasant was murdered from the moment the man responsible finally stood before a federal judge. 11 years can make a crime feel like ancient history to everyone except the people who lived through it. The world moves. People change. Headlines disappear. New tragedies replace old ones. And yet for a family waiting for justice, the calendar does not erase anything. It simply adds another date to the list of dates they can never forget. December 29th, 2013. The night the vehicle burned. The night Marie's life ended. The beginning of a question that would remain unanswered for years. Then November 2023. The arrest. Then August 2024. The guilty plea. Then April 3rd, 2025. The life sentence. Between those dates was a story of uncertainty, investigation, forensic science, and persistence. But there was also a story about what happens when a victim becomes a cold case. At first, the case is everywhere. The victim's name is spoken constantly. Investigators make calls. Witnesses are interviewed. Evidence is collected. News reports appear. Family members answer questions. The community talks. Everyone believes the answer may be just around the corner. Then the weeks become months. The months become years. The phone stops ringing. The headlines disappear. The public attention moves elsewhere. The case becomes one of thousands. But for the family, the victim remains one. One person. One absence. One unanswered question. Marie was not a number. She was not simply a homicide statistic. She was a young woman whose life had been violently interrupted. And because the investigation remained unresolved for so long, her family had to live with a particularly cruel form of uncertainty. They knew she had been murdered. They did not know exactly who was responsible. That distinction is enormous. Imagine knowing the worst possible thing has happened and still not knowing who did it. Imagine seeing the person you love reduced to a photograph on a missing and murdered poster. Imagine hearing investigators say that the case remains active. Imagine every knock on the door, every unexpected phone call, every new rumor, every possible lead. Then imagine years passing without an answer. That is what makes cold cases so psychologically devastating. The unknown becomes part of daily life. It sits beside birthdays. It sits beside holidays. It sits beside ordinary family conversations. It becomes something everyone carries without talking about it. Then suddenly, after years of silence, the phone rings again. But this time a call is different. There is an arrest. There is a suspect. There is evidence. There is movement. For Marie's family, that moment must have carried conflicting emotions. The person they had been waiting to identify was finally identified. But the identity was not necessarily the kind of answer anyone wanted. Ernest D. Pheasant Sr. was not a distant stranger pulled from an unrelated database. He was Marie's estranged husband. That fact gave the case a painful intimacy. The investigation was no longer simply about an unknown predator. It was about a relationship. It was about a man and woman whose lives had once been connected. And that is where the emotional weight of the case becomes almost impossible to describe. Because a homicide committed by a stranger is terrifying. A homicide committed within a relationship is terrifying in a different way. It forces people to reconsider the meaning of familiarity. The face you recognize. The person whose name you know. The person whose history intersects with yours. The person who can move through ordinary spaces without attracting suspicion. When investigators discovered the DNA connection, the case did not suddenly become simple. It became personal. The forensic evidence gave investigators a direction. The investigation gave that direction context. And the context led toward a sequence of events that prosecutors would eventually present to the federal court. According to the government's case, Marie was killed at the home she shared with Ernest. She suffered fatal stab wounds. Her body was then transported in a vehicle. The vehicle was driven to the Big Cove area. It was set on fire. That sequence matters because every stage served a different purpose. The killing caused the death. The movement concealed the original location. The fire attempted to destroy evidence. But the evidence survived. And that is where the investigation became a battle between destruction and preservation. Someone tried to erase the physical record. The physical record resisted. The fire destroyed some things. It did not destroy everything. The passage of time erased some memories. It did not erase the DNA. The years created distance. They did not erase the connection. This is why investigators returned to the case. The evidence still had value. The reopened investigation in 2022 was not merely a ceremonial review of an old homicide. Investigators were looking for something actionable, something that could transform suspicion into proof, something that could survive a courtroom. And the baseball cap provided exactly the kind of lead investigators needed. DNA analysis is often described as if it were a magic button. It is not. Behind every DNA result is a process. Evidence has to be recovered, preserved, documented, tested, compared, interpreted, and then placed within the larger investigative picture. The result must make sense alongside everything else. That is what makes the breakthrough in Marie's case so significant. The DNA was not floating in isolation. It existed within a case involving a burned vehicle, a homicide, a victim, a relationship, and a long investigative history. The forensic connection became one part of a much larger evidentiary structure. And eventually, that structure was strong enough to produce an arrest. November 2023. Ernest Pheasant was taken into custody. After nearly 11 years, the investigation had finally crossed the line from uncertainty to prosecution. The man who had been connected to the evidence now faced the consequences of the crime. But the legal process still had to unfold. There is a difference between an arrest and a conviction. An arrest is an allegation. A conviction is a legal finding. A guilty plea occupies a different place. It is an admission. And when Ernest pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in Indian country in August 2024, the case entered its final legal phase. The prosecution no longer needed to prove the case to a jury. The defendant had admitted responsibility. The years of uncertainty had finally reached a legal conclusion. But for Marie's family, the word guilty could not possibly carry only one emotion. There was relief. There was grief. There was anger. There may have been a sense of vindication. And there was the unavoidable realization that the person responsible would now be permanently identified with Marie's death. The court would eventually sentence him to life in federal prison. That happened on April 3rd, 2025. Life. The maximum permanence the criminal justice system could impose in this case. And with that sentence, the legal system effectively closed the book. But cold cases have a strange relationship with closure. The word is used constantly. Closure. As if a guilty plea can close a wound. As if a sentence can return the missing years. As if a courtroom can restore the person who was taken. It cannot. Justice and closure are not identical. Justice can hold someone accountable. Closure is emotional. Closure belongs to survivors. And survivors decide whether they feel it. For some families, an arrest provides relief. For others, it creates another wave of grief. For many, both happen simultaneously. The truth is that there is no single emotional response to finally learning who killed someone you love. The answer may be necessary. But necessary does not mean easy. And Marie's story reminds us of that distinction. The investigation ended. The grief did not. The sentence ended the criminal proceeding. It did not end the family's memories. The evidence established responsibility. It could not establish what Marie's future would have been. That future was lost permanently. And perhaps that is why the most powerful part of this story is not the courtroom. It is the persistence that came before it. The investigators who refused to let the case remain buried. The agencies that reopened the investigation. The forensic specialists who examined old evidence. The family members who continued to remember Marie. The people who kept her name alive. Every cold case requires that kind of persistence. Because time favors the unknown. Time gives witnesses opportunities to forget. Time gives suspects opportunities to disappear from public attention. Time allows evidence to degrade. Time changes circumstances. But persistence works in the opposite direction. Persistence keeps asking, what happened? Who did this? What did we miss? What evidence remains? Can we test it again? Can modern science tell us something the original investigation could not? Those questions eventually transform Marie's case. And that is why the story of the baseball cap is so much larger than the object itself. The cap represents something almost philosophical about forensic investigation. Evidence can outlive the people who created it. The person who left the DNA may never have imagined that a decade later it would become critical evidence. The object did not know it was important. It simply remained. That is often how investigations are solved. Not through a dramatic clue announcing its importance. Through ordinary objects that become extraordinary only after investigators understand what they contain. The cap was ordinary. The DNA was microscopic. The consequence was enormous. A decade of uncertainty was transformed into a prosecution. The case moved from an unknown killer to a named defendant. The family moved from unanswered questions to accountability. And the federal court moved from accusation to sentence. But there is still something unsettling about the fact that it took so long. Why did the answer require more than 10 years? Why was the case not solved immediately? Why did the evidence remain silent for so long? Cold cases rarely have one simple answer. Investigations evolve. Technology evolves. Evidence is re-examined. Agencies gain new resources. New personnel bring new perspectives. And sometimes, an old piece of evidence becomes useful only after a new investigator asks a different question. That is what makes time both the enemy and the ally of cold case investigations. Time destroys. But time also brings new technology. Time creates new databases. Time changes forensic capabilities. Time allows old assumptions to be challenged. The very years that seemed to bury Marie's case eventually helped create the conditions for solving it. The case was reopened in 2022. The arrest came in 2023. The guilty plea came in 2024. The sentence came in 2025. The sequence is almost impossible to imagine when viewed from the perspective of December 2013. On that night, no one standing near the burning vehicle could have known that the investigation would stretch across more than a decade. No one could have known that a baseball cap would eventually become important. No one could have known that DNA testing would help identify the person responsible. No one could have known that a federal courtroom would eventually deliver a life sentence. At the scene, there was only the immediate horror. A burned vehicle. A dead woman. A community beginning to understand that something terrible had happened. The rest would come later. Much later. And that is what makes the story so haunting. The truth was not created in 2022. It was uncovered. It had been waiting in the evidence since 2013. The DNA did not suddenly appear. The connection had always been there. The investigators simply had not yet reached it. That distinction changes the way we think about unsolved murders. A cold case may appear empty. It may appear exhausted. It may appear to have no remaining leads. But sometimes the evidence is still there. Sometimes the answer is already sitting inside the case file. Sometimes the breakthrough is not new information. It is new attention. And Marie's case is a powerful example of that. The years did not defeat the investigation. They delayed it. The fire did not erase the evidence. It reduced it. The killer did not erase the story. He became part of it. And Marie's name remained. That is ultimately what survived. Not the flames. Not the vehicle. Not the silence. Marie. Her name. Her memory. Her family. And the evidence that eventually made it impossible for her murder to remain an unanswered question. More than 10 years later, the baseball cap had helped expose the man responsible. The courtroom had delivered its sentence. The federal case had reached its end. But the memory of Marie Walkingstick Pheasant does not belong to the courtroom. It belongs to the people who knew her. And as long as they remember her, she is more than a cold case. She is more than a headline. She is more than a photograph attached to the words murdered and unsolved. She is Marie. And after 11 years of uncertainty, the world finally knew what her family had been waiting to hear. The truth had survived. It had survived the fire. It had survived the years. It had survived the silence. And when investigators finally returned to the evidence, it was still there, waiting. The evidence had survived, but the years had left another kind of damage behind. They had changed the people connected to the case. They had changed the community. They had changed the investigators. And they had changed the meaning of every unanswered question. For more than a decade, Marie Walkingstick Pheasant's murder existed in that strange space between memory and evidence. The facts were known, but the full story was not. Everyone knew she was dead. Everyone knew her death was violent. Everyone knew a fire had consumed the vehicle where her body was discovered. But knowing those facts was not the same as knowing the truth. Truth requires connection. A victim. A suspect. A timeline. Un motive. An opportunity. Physical evidence. And ultimately, a chain strong enough to survive the passage of time. The renewed investigation began rebuilding that chain. Investigators were no longer looking at Marie's death as an isolated event from December 2013. They were looking at everything surrounding it. Her relationship with Ernest. The home. The vehicle. The movements of the people involved. The evidence recovered after the fire. The statements made during the original investigation. And the forensic material that had remained untouched for years. Each detail had to be reconsidered. Nothing could simply be assumed. Because when an investigation is more than 10 years old, assumptions can become dangerous. Memory can change. Stories can change. People can forget. And investigators have to separate what was actually documented from what people later believe had happened. That process can be slow. Painfully slow. But it is necessary. Because a cold case cannot be solved by emotion alone. It must be solved by evidence. And the evidence in Marie's case was beginning to speak more clearly. The baseball cap was one of the most important pieces. DNA associated with Ernest Pheasant had been recovered from the cap. That discovery did not merely give investigators a name. It gave them a direction. A direction that could be tested. A direction that could either collapse under scrutiny or become stronger. Investigators pursued the second possibility. They looked at the relationship between Marie and Ernest. They examined the circumstances surrounding her death. They reconstructed the movement of the vehicle. They considered the location where the vehicle had been burned. And they asked what the person responsible would have needed to do to create the scene investigators originally encountered. The picture that emerged was disturbing. The fire was not the beginning. It was the attempted ending. Someone had already killed Marie. Then someone had attempted to destroy the evidence. That meant the burned vehicle represented an act of concealment. And concealment tells investigators something important. It suggests that the person responsible understood, at least to some degree, that what had happened needed to be hidden. The fire was not simply destruction. It was a message. Erase the evidence. Erase the scene. Erase the connection. But the plan was incomplete, because evidence remained. And the more investigators examined what survived, the harder it became to separate Ernest from the case. There is a particular psychological trap in a murder investigation. Investigators can become attached to a theory. Once a suspect emerges, there's always a danger of interpreting every piece of evidence through that suspect. That is why strong investigations require independent verification. Could the evidence actually place Ernest at the scene? Could the relationship explain his connection to Marie? Could the timeline fit? Could the physical evidence be reconciled with the prosecution's reconstruction? The answers increasingly pointed in the same direction. And eventually, federal prosecutors were prepared to move forward. The arrest in November 2023 transformed the case once again. For years, the family had been waiting for a name. Now, they had one. But the public often misunderstands what an arrest means. An arrest does not mean the investigation is finished. It means the investigation has reached a point where prosecutors believe there is sufficient basis to bring the suspect into the criminal justice system. The case then enters another stage. Court. Evidence. Charges. Legal arguments. Potential trial. Potential plea. And for families, another period of waiting. The arrest could not immediately answer every question. It could not restore Marie. It could not explain every moment. It could not erase 11 years of uncertainty. It simply meant that the man investigators believed responsible was finally facing the consequences of the allegation. Then came the decision that would eliminate the need for a trial. Ernest Pheasant pleaded guilty. First-degree murder in Indian country. The words were formal. But behind them was an enormous human reality. A family had waited years. Investigators had spent years. A community had lived with a cold case. And now the defendant was admitting responsibility. The guilty plea also gave the prosecution's reconstruction a final legal weight. Marie had been murdered. Her body had been moved. The vehicle had been burned. And the man accused of carrying out the killing accepted responsibility. The mystery surrounding the identity of her killer was over. But the mystery surrounding the emotional reality of the crime could never be completely resolved. No court document can describe what a mother means to her children. No forensic report can describe the sound of her voice. No DNA profile can preserve a person's laugh. No sentencing hearing can recreate the ordinary moments that existed before the crime. Those are the things violence takes. Not only a life, an entire future. Marie should have continued living. She should have grown older. Her children should have known her through new memories, not only old photographs and stories. There should have been more holidays, more conversations, more ordinary days, more arguments that would have eventually been forgotten, more birthdays, more years. Instead, there was a case file, a photograph, a date, and a question. The investigation could answer who killed her. It could not answer who she would have become. That future disappeared with her. And this is where the story moves beyond forensic science. Because forensic science can identify, it can compare, it can connect, but it cannot repair. Justice can punish. It cannot restore. The sentence can last a lifetime, but Marie's life was supposed to last much longer. On April 3, 2025, the federal court sentenced Ernest Pheasant to life imprisonment. The legal process had reached its final destination. There would be no more uncertainty over whether he would face punishment for Marie's murder. The sentence was permanent, but the memory of the case remained complicated. For more than 10 years, Marie's murder had existed as an unsolved crime. Then almost suddenly the narrative changed. An investigation was reopened. DNA was examined. A suspect was identified. An arrest was made. A guilty plea was entered. A life sentence followed. When viewed as a sequence, it can appear almost simple. But none of those steps were simple. Every step depended on the one before it. Without preserved evidence, there might have been no DNA. Without DNA, there might have been no forensic connection. Without the connection, investigators would have had to rely on other evidence. Without a strong investigation, an arrest might not have followed. Without the prosecution, the case might not have reached a courtroom. And without the guilty plea, the family might have endured another painful stage of litigation. The final outcome was therefore not the result of one piece of evidence alone. It was the result of persistence. That word appears repeatedly in cold cases. Persistence. Not giving up. Not assuming the absence of an immediate answer means there will never be an answer. Not allowing an old file to become invisible. The investigators who returned to Marie's case understood something fundamental. A cold case is not necessarily a case without evidence. Sometimes it is a case with evidence that has not yet been fully understood. That distinction can determine whether a victim's story remains unresolved. The baseball cap was an example of that principle. An ordinary object became extraordinary because investigators eventually understood what it contained. And DNA has a peculiar relationship with time. It does not care whether a case is 10 years old. It does not care whether the headlines have disappeared. It does not care whether the public remembers. If the biological material survives and can be properly analyzed, it can still provide information. The passage of time can make the investigation harder, but it does not automatically make the evidence meaningless. That is one reason cold case units continue to exist. They look at the evidence everyone else thought had already been exhausted. They ask whether technology has changed, whether databases have expanded, whether forensic methods have improved, whether old assumptions should be challenged, whether a witness remembers something differently, whether an object that seemed insignificant now has significance. Sometimes the breakthrough comes from a brand new witness, sometimes from an old photograph, sometimes from digital records, and sometimes from DNA. Marie's case carried all the characteristics of a crime that might have remained unresolved indefinitely. A burned vehicle, a murdered young woman, a decade of uncertainty, a community trying to remember, a family waiting. But the evidence had not disappeared. The investigation simply needed to return to it. And when investigators did, the case began moving again. There's something deeply unsettling about imagining that object sitting in evidence for years. The cap existed while the investigation was active. It existed while the investigation went quiet. It existed while Marie's family continued grieving. It existed while the calendar moved from 2013 to 2014, then 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, and finally 2022, year after year. The cap remained. The evidence remained. The truth remained hidden inside it. That is the strange patience of physical evidence. It does not demand attention. It does not become impatient. It simply waits. And sometimes, the people investigating a case eventually catch up with it. The reopened investigation did exactly that. It connected old evidence with new investigative resources. It transformed a forgotten object into a forensic lead. And that lead helped investigators identify the man who would eventually admit to murdering Marie. The story, therefore, has an almost circular structure. The crime begins with an attempt to destroy evidence. The investigation begins with the discovery of the destruction. Years pass. The evidence survives. Investigators return. The evidence identifies a suspect. The suspect is arrested. The suspect pleads guilty. And the court imposes a life sentence. The attempt to erase the crime ultimately becomes part of the evidence proving it. The fire was meant to conceal. Instead, it became one of the defining elements of the case. The burned vehicle became a symbol of the effort to hide what happened. The baseball cap became a symbol of what could not be hidden. One represented destruction. The other represented persistence. And between them was Marie, a young woman whose life ended in violence. A woman whose family waited more than 10 years for justice. A woman whose case eventually became an example of why investigators must never assume an old case is beyond solving. Because there is no expiration date on a victim's right to justice. There is no date when a family is supposed to stop asking questions. There is no moment when a murder becomes less important simply because the calendar has moved forward. The world may move on. The investigation does not have to. And sometimes the answer is still waiting. Waiting inside a file. Waiting inside a laboratory sample. Waiting inside a database. Waiting inside a photograph. Waiting inside a witness's memory. Or waiting on something as ordinary as a baseball cap. The case of Marie Walkingstick Pheasant is now legally resolved. But the years before that resolution remain part of the story. They remind us that justice can take a long time. They remind us that evidence can survive. And they remind us that the word cold should never be mistaken for forgotten. A cold case is a wound that has not closed. Marie's wound remained open for more than a decade. Then investigators returned. They looked again. They tested again. They followed the evidence again. And finally, the silence broke. Not because the past had changed, because someone finally found the connection that had been there all along. A tiny biological trace. A simple object. A name. And from that name came an arrest. From the arrest came a guilty plea. From the guilty plea came a life sentence. But beneath every legal milestone was the same question that had existed from the beginning. Who was Marie? She was not merely the woman inside the burned vehicle. She was not merely the victim in a federal case. She was not merely the subject of a cold case investigation. She was a human being whose future was stolen. And that is why the investigation mattered. Because solving a case is not only about identifying a perpetrator. It is about refusing to allow the victim to disappear twice. Once through violence, and again through forgetting. Marie did not disappear. Her name remained. Her family remembered. Investigators returned. The evidence survived. And eventually, the law answered. The fire had burned through metal. It had filled the night with smoke. It had attempted to destroy the physical story of what happened. But it could not destroy everything. The DNA remained. The case remained. Marie remained in the memory of the people who loved her. And more than 10 years later, the truth finally emerged from the silence. The truth had finally emerged, but truth alone does not explain why a case can remain silent for so long. To understand the weight of Marie Walkingstick Pheasant's story, you have to understand what happens after the sirens leave, after the investigators photograph the scene, after the evidence is collected and the news cameras disappear. That is when a murder becomes something different. It becomes a permanent absence. On December 29, 2013, Marie was 26 years old. By the time the investigation finally produced a guilty plea, more than a decade had passed. A child could have been born on the day of the murder and entered adolescence before the legal system reached its conclusion. A house could change owners. A road could look different. People who once knew every detail of the case could grow older and forget pieces of what they remembered. But one thing did not change. Marie was still dead. That is the cruelest feature of time in a homicide case. Time moves for everyone except the victim. The victim remains exactly where the crime left them. Marie would never see another year. Her children would continue growing. Her family would continue aging. The community would continue changing. But Marie's life remained fixed at 26. That is why cold cases are so much more than investigative puzzles. They are unfinished histories. Every year that passes adds another layer between the investigators and the original event. But beneath those layers is still the same human tragedy. A person was alive. Then that person was not. And someone was responsible. For years, that responsibility remained unidentified. The original investigation had to contend with a scene complicated by fire. Fire does not simply destroy evidence. It changes the physical language of a crime scene. Materials behave differently under extreme heat. Surfaces are altered. Objects can fracture. Patterns can disappear. Investigators must distinguish between damage caused by the fire and evidence created before the fire. That is difficult even when investigators arrive immediately. Imagine attempting it years later. Every surviving detail becomes more valuable. Every object matters. Every photograph matters. Every laboratory record matters. The old evidence has to be treated as though it could contain the answer. because sometimes it does. The baseball cap became important for exactly that reason. It had survived. And inside the evidence associated with it was a biological connection to Ernest D. Pheasant Sr. That connection did not exist in isolation. It existed within a homicide investigation involving Marie, within the circumstances of a burned vehicle, within the history of a marriage, within a case that had remained unresolved for years. Investigators could now ask a much sharper question. If Ernest's DNA was associated with the cap, what did that mean? Was it consistent with the circumstances surrounding the crime? Could it be explained innocently? Could it be placed into a broader timeline? Could other evidence support the same conclusion? Those are the questions that separate a lead from a case. A lead points. A case proves. The renewed investigation had to transform the first into the second. And that meant revisiting everything. The home. The vehicle. The location where Marie was found. The physical evidence. The relationship. The circumstances before the murder. The circumstances after it. The investigators who worked the case in 2022 were effectively stepping into a crime that had happened before many of the modern forensic tools now available to them had reached their current capabilities. That is one of the strange advantages of time. Time is devastating for witnesses. But time can be useful to science. Technology changes. Databases grow. DNA analysis becomes more sophisticated. Investigators gain access to tools that did not exist or were not routinely available when an older case was first examined. A cold case can therefore exist in two different timelines. The human timeline moves farther away from the crime. The technological timeline moves closer to solving it. Marie's case eventually reached the point where those two timelines crossed. The evidence from 2013 met the investigative technology of the 2020s. And the result was an identification. But there is another reason this case matters. It demonstrates the importance of cooperation. The investigation eventually involved federal authorities, the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, the North Carolina State Highway Patrol, the Cherokee Indian Police Department, and the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians Office of the Tribal Prosecutor. Multiple agencies, multiple jurisdictions, multiple investigative responsibilities. One victim, one murder, one unanswered question. When a case involves tribal lands and federal jurisdiction, the legal and investigative landscape can become complicated. The existence of multiple authorities can create challenges in determining who investigates, who prosecutes, and how evidence moves through the system. Yet cooperation can turn those challenges into resources. One agency may possess a piece of information another does not. One investigator may recognize a connection another investigator missed. One laboratory may be able to conduct testing that was unavailable years earlier. One database may contain information that changes the direction of the investigation. A cold case can be solved because the right people finally have access to the right pieces. That is what makes the renewed investigation significant. Marie's case was not simply dusted off. It was reassembled. The past was brought into the present. And once Ernest Pheasant became the focus of the investigation, the evidence could be evaluated against a specific person. That changed everything. Investigators no longer had to ask who might have committed the crime. They could ask whether the evidence supported Ernest's involvement. That is a much more precise investigation. The prosecution ultimately alleged that Ernest killed Marie at their home, stabbed her in the neck and abdomen, transported her body, and burned the vehicle in an effort to conceal the crime. Those allegations transformed the meaning of the original scene. The fire was no longer simply an unexplained event. It was part of a sequence. The vehicle was not merely where Marie was found. It was part of an attempt to conceal what had happened before she was placed inside it. The investigators were effectively reconstructing a crime that had been deliberately fragmented. And reconstruction requires patience. Imagine looking at a shattered mirror and trying to determine what the original reflection looked like. One fragment shows a piece of a face. Another shows a wall. Another shows a hand. Another shows nothing recognizable at all. Individually, the pieces appear useless. Together, they reveal an image. That is what forensic investigation can become. A burned vehicle. A body. A capítulo. DNA. A relationship. A timeline. Each piece alone has limitations. Together, they can become a narrative. And that narrative eventually became strong enough to bring Ernest Pheasant into federal court. But the most significant moment did not happen when the investigators first identified him. It happened when he admitted what he had done. August 16, 2024. Ernest Pheasant pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in Indian country. After more than 10 years, the case no longer required speculation about the identity of Marie's killer. The defendant had accepted responsibility. The legal uncertainty had ended. But the emotional uncertainty was different. A guilty plea can answer one question. It cannot answer every question. Marie's family may always wonder about the moments that were never documented. The final conversation. The final thoughts. The final moments of fear. Those are things the court cannot recover. There is no forensic test for a person's final emotion. There is no database containing the last thought of a victim. There is only the evidence left behind. And sometimes that evidence tells us enough to establish responsibility without ever revealing every private detail. That is the limit of criminal investigation. It can reconstruct. It cannot resurrect. It can establish. It cannot restore. It can punish. It cannot undo. The sentence imposed on April 3, 2025, therefore carried enormous legal significance. Life imprisonment. The person responsible for Marie's murder would spend the rest of his life in federal custody. The case that had once been unresolved now had a final legal outcome. But outside the courtroom, Marie's family still had to live with the loss. That is why the word closure should be used carefully. For an investigator, a case can be closed. For a prosecutor, a case can be resolved. For a court, a judgment can be final. But grief does not operate according to legal terminology. A mother does not stop being missed because a judge delivers a sentence. A daughter does not become less loved because a defendant pleads guilty. A sister does not become less important because the investigation is over. The crime ends. The relationship does not. Marie remains part of the people who knew her. And that is perhaps the most important thing to remember when discussing a cold case. The investigation is not the victim's life. It is only what happened to the victim. Marie existed before the murder. She had a personality, a voice, a history, people who loved her, dreams that existed independently of the crime. The murder interrupted all of that. It did not define everything she had been. And after the case was solved, remembering her as a whole person became even more important. Because a solved case can create another danger. Once the killer is identified, public attention often shifts away from the victim. The mystery is over. The headline changes. The name of the suspect becomes more prominent. The courtroom becomes the center of the story. But Marie should remain at the center. She was the reason the investigation existed. She was the reason the evidence mattered. She was the reason investigators returned to the case. She was the reason the family kept waiting. And she was the reason justice was pursued. The baseball cap did not solve the case by itself. Investigators did. Technology did. Forensic science helped. The evidence helped. But behind all of it was a simple principle. Someone had been murdered, and someone had to answer for it. That principle survived 11 years of uncertainty. It survived the fire. It survived the silence. It survived the distance between the original investigators and the new ones. It survived changes in technology. It survived changes in public attention. And eventually, it reached the courtroom. That is why Marie Walkingstick Pheasant's case deserves to be remembered. Not because it is an unusual crime. Sadly, murder is not unusual. Not because cold cases are rare. They are not. But because this case demonstrates how a seemingly forgotten piece of evidence can remain capable of changing everything. A baseball cap. A trace of DNA. A connection. A reopened investigation. An arrest. A guilty plea. A life sentence. The chain is almost invisible when viewed one link at a time. But together, the links form a path from December 2013 to April 2025. More than 11 years. More than 4,000 days. More than 4,000 mornings when Marie's family woke up without her. More than 4,000 nights when the unanswered question remained. And then, finally, an answer. The killer's identity was no longer hidden. The courtroom record was no longer empty. The investigation was no longer cold. But the mountain community still carries the memory of the woman whose life ended there. And that memory is bigger than the fire. Bigger than the vehicle. Bigger than the DNA. Bigger than the defendant. Because the final lesson of this case is not simply that forensic science can solve old murders. It is that evidence deserves patience. Victims deserve persistence. Families deserve answers. And time should never be mistaken for permission to forget. The person who killed Marie may have believed that burning the vehicle would destroy the story. But the story survived. It survived because the investigators kept records. It survived because evidence was preserved. It survived because someone reopened the case. It survived because modern forensic science could examine what remained. And it survived because Marie's name never disappeared. That is the image that remains when everything else is stripped away. Not the flames. Not the smoke. Not the courtroom. Not the sentence. A name. Marie Walkingstick Pheasant. A name that remained alive while the case waited. A name that returned to the headlines when investigators reopened the investigation. A name that appeared in federal court. A name that now belongs to a case with a legal conclusion. And perhaps the most haunting thought is that the answer had been physically present all along. The DNA did not arrive years later. It had already been there. The evidence did not suddenly become connected to Ernest. The investigators eventually discovered the connection. The past did not change. What changed was the ability to understand it. That is the essence of a cold case breakthrough. The crime remains fixed. The evidence remains. But the questions become sharper. The tools become better. And someone finally sees what everyone had been looking at. For Marie, that moment came more than 10 years after the fire. Too late to save her, but not too late to establish the truth. And sometimes, after years of silence, that is where justice begins. Not with a dramatic confession, not with a miraculous discovery, but with someone opening an old case file and refusing to close it again. Because somewhere inside that file is still a victim, still a family, still a question. And sometimes, if investigators keep looking, still an answer.